Lessons 14 to 15 in Dobson go together as a unit. You get introduced to your standard verbs first and then to your contract verbs, doing the same thing. So that means once you've got chapter 14, all you're doing is developing that in chapter 15. So it's a good idea to take the two together. And this is taking you out of the present tense at last and thinking about the Greek tense system. So, the Greek tense system as a whole. I want to introduce it as a whole because this will prime us ready to start texts as soon as possible, but also give you a sense of the roadmap of the language that you're currently going to be filling in bits of as you go. There are 6 tenses in Greek: present, future, imperfect, aorist, perfect and pluperfect. All of the last 4 would be categorised as past. So the past is not a tense per se in Greek, but you're going to be doing different things with the past which will be expressed with one of those 4. The good news is the last 2 aren't really used very much unless you're reading 1 John. So you don't need to think about them too much, you need to recognise them, but it's those first 4 that are used again and again and again repeatedly all over the place throughout your texts, and they're all marked very well. Luo. You have a stem, you have an ending. All is well. For the future, you need a sigma after the stem. And you also need that for the aorist. And then you will put on an ending. All past tenses in Greek have an augment. So all past tenses in Greek will start with some kind of E. The imperfect will then have nothing further than its endings. The aorist has got its sigma as well, and then an ending characterised by an alpha. And once you go into the other tenses, you start marking things even further. You'll notice I haven't put a breathing on either the perfect or the pluperfect. That's because there's actually more to it than the idea of an augment. What you've actually got is a reduplicated stem, lel. So you've taken that first consonant and you've doubled it, joining together the two with an epsilon. And then the pluperfect is indeed also augmented. You do then have a kappa marking the perfect and the pluperfect before you get your endings. The endings are then the same in the perfect as they were in the aorist and slightly different in the pluperfect. So, the further back in the past you get in Greek, the bigger your word gets. One of the reasons we teach with luo is by the time you get to eleleukein, you've got a huge word with just lu as a stem. And it can be difficult to spot that stem in amongst all of the morphological markers, which is one reason why I encourage speaking out loud, because it helps you to focus in on every single letter and think through what has been a prefix, what is your stem, and what is some kind of infix or suffix that's gone along the way. That's how you form them. What do they mean? Luo, I untie. Luso, I shall untie. For the difference between shall and will, look at Google. I'm a pedant. I don't mind if you say will, but I will probably stick to shall. Imperfect, I was untying. Aorist, I untied. Perfect, I have untied. Pluperfect, I had untied. We'll think more about the ramifications of each of these tenses. That's a very bold translation, but that is your basic system in Greek. You have your stem lu, you have a series of both suffix markers and prefix markers that help you move between the tenses, and each one of them points to a different way of expressing things temporarily. So, the imperfect. You know your present endings. Luo, lues, lue, luomen, lueta, luusim. The imperfect is also part of what we call the present system, so the endings don't actually differ that much. First of all, you've got your augment, your past tense augment, and then you've got some endings. On, es, omen, ete, on. So the endings aren't that different from the present ones. They're a little bit truncated, but they are recognisable. One note, that augment could of course cause problems. If you have something like akuo, you're going to end up with kuon, where the alpha plus epsilon has given you an eta. We need to have a look at what happens with those. We'll build up that as we go through the book, and you get a sense to think about what vowel changes mean. There are a few examples in chapter 14 and 15, so you will get a chance to see those in action, but start thinking about what you think might happen if you merge an epsilon with a vowel at the beginning of a verb. It is worth noticing that very few verbs in Greek start with an eta or an omega. So if you see an eta or an omega at the front of a word, assume it's a past tense and think what it might look like without an epsilon. And in fact, not that many verbs in Greek start with an epsilon either. So if you see any verb with a long vowel or an epsilon at the front, it's worth assuming, unless it's one you recognise instantly as an exception, that it's a past tense, and then thinking what the stem might actually be. You also need to think about contract verbs. So your present tense, poior, poies, poie, poiumen, poiete, poiusin. And your umen and ete were the ones that contracted and looked a little bit different. You're now going to have an issue of contracting that epsilon with your new endings. So if we put that epsilon in, remember you've got your augment all the way through as well. Just pop that in to remind you. As well as that epsilon in the stem. Poeon, poes, poe, poeomen, poiete, poeon. You can see that there's going to have to be some contraction there. So we have your augment, and then we have some contractions. Epoiun, epoies, epoie, epoiumen, epoiete, epoiun. This time the contraction has actually affected all of them, because all of them have involved some kind of doubled up vowel. So you need to learn the imperfect contracted verbs a little bit carefully. If you look at Dobson, page 90, he gives you a roundup of all the different contractions with an epsilon, with an alpha, and with an omicron. So do have a look at that, because it will affect what's going on. How do you use it? The basic use is past continuous. This is I was untying. I was walking around when. It sets a scene. It also gives you a kind of generic scene of undefined past. So you might get it in the beginning of parables of once upon a time there was. If you're reading Luke, it might well be something you'll see starting off a parable, for example. The next is what we call inceptive or inchoative, and this is I begin to. And you might see this where disciples hear Jesus saying something and they begin to react. The Pharisees begin to react as a result of his words. So remember that that's there as a possibility. And then we can have I kept untying, or I used to untie. So different ways of expressing a kind of past action that is not bounded and default. Run through these as a checklist in your head. If you're interested in them, we can look into them a bit more thoroughly and look at the whole range. But if you start off with the I was doing it, but remember the other ones and work out what in context you think is going on, then you'll be okay. The last thing in this chapter is to think about questions. First of all, you do have such a thing as a question mark. It's marked by a semicolon. Second of all, there is an interrogative, which is a question word. And this word is really important because you saw hoheto, the definite article, give you 50% of your noun, pronoun, adjective endings. This is going to give you the other 50%. So you really need to know this one. Tis. This is the indefinite pronoun without an accent, and it's the interrogative with an accent. So this is another place where accents matter tis without an accent, a, tis with an accent, who. The first thing to note is this is the third declension. It's going to change its stem. So you are going to need a separate letter buffering your endings most of the time. And that, in this case, is a new. After that, the endings aren't difficult. Tis, tina, tinos, tini, tines, tinas, tinon, tissy. Well, actually, N plus S has gone to just a sigma there because Greek wouldn't like the syllable tinsy. So you can actually scrub out that and put in tissy instead. Ti, tinos, tini, tina, tina, tinon, tissy. So the neuter is still the same as the nominative and accusative. It still ends in an alpha in the nominative and accusative plural. So we still have patterns. We still have our genitive plurals all ending in omega nu. We still have the neuter being the same as the masculine after the nominative and accusative. So there are still patterns here, but now you've only got a masculine and feminine as one unit and then the neuter as another. So learning tis is really, really, really important. Bookmark this and make sure you learn it carefully because it will be the key to helping you through lots more Greek. And you can find it on page 88 in Dobson.